Welcome back to our study of Secrets of the Scrolls. This is all about prophecy that's been revealed or we will be revisiting it. And we are in part 2 today of the Copper Scroll. We are in the caves outside Qumran in the Judean hills where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Copper Scroll was one of those. And so I'm going to summarize a little bit of number 1, part 1 of this. And I'd encourage you, if you did not view it yet, go back and do number 1 first. And then it'll put you right at the doorstep of this one, and you can continue on along with the teaching of it and be right up where we're at. All right, may I just remind you, a date that is not on here would be 1946. It was when the Copper Scrolls were found, and in caves outside the ruins of Qumran. And after those initial finds, there was a lot of organization, a lot of study. And lo and behold, when the archaeologists were going back and finding new caves, for instance, Cave 3 in 1956, they not only emptied it, but went back in for another look and were digging around, and they knocked in an extra hidden wall, and just like a cubby hole. And back in there was the only scrolls. There were 2 of them, but they really are one that was made out of metal. They were made out of copper. And when they pulled them out, they saw and they started to work on them and cut them to find out how long this is. It was a foot wide, in this sense tall, and 12 feet long. Was badly oxidized and very brittle but intact, and on it was 64 hidden locations and 57 places of treasure, of the treasures of some temple treasure, some just the coffers of Israel. This is a better picture of the Copper Scroll rolled out a little bit. And here's an artist's concept of Qumran when it was up and running and occupied and things were well. As I told my class, I will always show you pictures of Qumran facing sort of south, the direction that this is going. So I'm going to put the actual ruins on now, and you can just see, okay, I see that mesa where the people are at. And the benchmark, or the place of reference, is this ritual bath pool that the blue arrow is pointing down to. And I'm going to go back to the other original artist concept, and you see where that would locate in this drawing. It's on the inside of that last building facing south. And then if you were to tour and go see the city of Qumran, this is a reconstruction during the Second Temple period. This would be the time of Christ, and then this would not last much longer than that. But you can see how they have aqueducts and things that are mentioned, a lot of ritual baths because they were Levites and they were servants of God and they needed to keep themselves clean, but it was a good idea for anyone. Their cisterns, the refectory, number 4, which is the upper center, like the L-shaped building. A refectory was for study of scripture and educational curriculum and materials, or a place of being taught. And so a certain scribe could be there that had knowledge of something and said, let me read this to you, we'll study this and learn about this today. And so the Essenes were the guardians of the scrolls. I believe that they wrote a lot of them because there was a lot of inkwells found here when they dug up the city or were digging up some of the city. But they also brought others in. So let me leave the city alone because we need to get where we were last week. I left off introducing everyone to Jim Barfield, and here's the history with him, and I've put it all together. And before I close today, we're going to go on a treasure hunt and find one of the locations of one of the treasures. So if you'll just mind reading right along with me, and you can stop the video anytime you want and reread something. Since the 1990s, Barfield has spent thousands of hours and many years studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. He loved them, and that was his thing. In 2006, after he retired, he had a lot more time on his hands, and another Dead Sea Scrolls enthusiast, Vigil Jones, ignited a new passion in Barfield for the Copper Scroll. See, the Copper Scrolls had been found. What was the date that I gave you? Way back in 57? And that's like 10 years after the Dead Sea Scrolls, the original ones, were found. And so these have been around a long time, almost 40 years. And people sort of didn't know what to do with them. They translated them. Treasure hunters were looking around throughout Israel where they thought they would be found, or what the scroll said. And Barfield was pretty well at the end of his Dead Sea Scrolls interest, and so this was all that he needed. And pardon the pun, but he was a fireman that was an inspector on how the fires started. So he is very good on details. And this, to the retired fireman, this put a fire under his feet and in his soul. And so he jumped in on this. Redirecting toward the treasure inventory, Barfield investigated the first location. That had been translated. The very first column of the Copper Scroll was the first treasure, and it read like this: in the ruin, which is in the valley of Achor, under the steps heading eastward, 40 cubits long, are silver service vessels weighing 17 talents. And so what happened was, you can't go digging at Qumran. However, you can go out and walk around as a tourist, and if you know how to pace well, you can measure things off somewhat and take notes. However, you can also go to the Israel Antiquities Authority, who has already done this, and they will pace things off. And so we're looking for something that's 40 cubits long, and Barfield, in looking over their diagrams and their measurements, found something that measured 39.98. Well, I declare that just might be 40 cubits. And so this is a copy of the top picture, is a copy of the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority survey, and a photo of the steps that went along with it. And the red dot is, and the east, and the large enough for 17 talents of vessels was put in by Barfield later on. But he would go through and he would study these things, but he started on the very first treasure on the first page and said, let me try to solve this. So he had to find where the Valley of Achor was, and I'm going to take you through those steps in a few minutes. So after discovering this and looking at this, Barfield scoured the ruins of Qumran and the foothills in light of his own translation of the Copper Scroll. What he had done, he had gotten into so much red tape, and we're going to look at red tape in a minute, that just discourages you. When you get promised, hey, we can let you in a month or in 6 months, come back, and he flies back in, and they say, well, we've decided just let the city of Qumran rest from anything for 3 years. Well, there's 3 years of his life that's just, and the time ahead of that sort of down the drain, because he's dead there, and so is anybody else. So what he did is he took his Strong's Dictionary and Concordance and he translated the Copper Scroll himself. He didn't wait for anybody. And in 2009, the IAA director was so impressed with what he had done and how he was identifying treasure sites, they gave him a team and told him to go after the gold. And so what came out of this was what he called the Copper Scroll Project. Now all of a sudden he's got the backing of a major government entity, and he's got a team that he's put together. And in 2014, to reignite passion for the Copper Scroll Project, as Barfield had named it, he procured an industrial strength metal detector. It could identify non-iron metals, gold, silver, brass, and copper up to 50 feet deep. And I showed this picture to the class. Of course, that is not a metal detector, it's a satellite. Maybe it can detect things, I'm sure it does, but it was not built for someone to walk around Qumran with it. Actually, what he got was this. And we'll come back to it, but we come to the point of this, that now teams put together, they've got an okay to start running these things over Judean hillsides, wherever Barfield felt that he had solved one of the locations. And you know, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were just found, and then the Copper Scroll 10 years later-ish was found, and they started deciphering it, treasure hunters were going all over the place, and that had to quickly be corralled. And if you wanted to have a digging permit or an archaeological permit, you had to have an Israeli archaeologist to sponsor you. And everything belonged to Israel. You didn't get to keep anything, but you could have the joy of, hey, I found this, but you're still part of the team, and you weren't necessarily going to get any credit for it. And so this was something that you did out of the love of it, not for the fame of it. So with this in mind, the treasure hunters were pretty much brought under control, and things really slowed down. As you can probably see from the 90s till now, we're very close to where we are living right now in 2021. So with all the green lights, let's go. And they went after it. However, as soon as they were ready to go and sought a permit from another agency, nope. They ran into red tape. Lots of it. Lots of it. So let's go back a little bit and let's find out why there's so much red tape in Israel today. Qumran, and by the way, Barfield felt that all of the treasure, all of those points were in Qumran or within eyesight up in the Judean hills, that they were all in the same area. And he had worked through all of these things based upon that. So with that in mind, Qumran is an area, what is called Area C, according to the 1993 Oslo Accords. It is considered, quote, disputed territory. What that means is you have three groups of people that think they own it. Israel, Jordan, which is on the other side of the Dead Sea, and the Palestinians, which are on this side, and in a lot of ways cohabit the nation of Israel with Israel. And they all claim that this land belongs to them, so anything there belongs to them. Here's something out of Joel Rosenberg's book, The Copper Scroll, which is a historical novel. So that's fictionalized. There's espionage, there's all sorts of name changes, etc. But there's a lot of facts. And listen to why everybody gets excited outside of Israel, like the Jordanians and the Palestinians and other Arab nations. This pretty well explains it. And it's this. The foursome had been mostly quiet since leaving the museum. Now Barak looked out the helicopter window at the Jordan Valley below. Then back at the Bennetts. Someone out there is deathly afraid that the temple treasures are about to be discovered, and they should be, he explained. Why? Because finding the treasures would provide conclusive historical proof that a Jewish temple once existed, thus sealing not only Israel's legal and historic claim to the Temple Mount, but to Jerusalem as her capital. This is high stakes, and that's really what this is all about. And you can see why an accord was made by Rabin, who was the prime minister of Israel, Bill Clinton, our president at the time, and Arafat, who represented the Palestinian Authority. And what came out of it was this map that was drawn by them of the nation of Israel. And the deep green is one of the easiest to understand. It gives the Palestinians full civil and military control. So look at the Gaza Strip. And then look at all the deep green that is within the West Bank. Those are places where the Palestinians, quote, own. Then B is the lighter green, and that allows the Palestinians to have civil control with joint military control, Israel and the Palestinians. And then C is full Israel civil and military control. That's all of the pink areas in the West Bank. The cream-colored is not disputed. It belongs to the nation of Israel herself. So why does Jordan and why is Qumran a disputed area? And what's Jordan have to do within this? Well, anytime there's a body of water, such as the Jordan River or the Dead Sea, then there's a dispute on who owns that. Or do you draw a line down the middle? And since it's a disputed area because it was a body of water. And the Dead Sea, Qumran, was right basically on the Dead Sea. You can see it from the ancient city, the archaeological ruins. So that's why it's a disputed area in there, that nobody owns that. The details of the accord declared the following, and here it is, and I won't elaborate on these. Israel is to withdraw from Jericho and Gaza, and eventually the West Bank. 5 years of limited autonomy for the Palestinians in those areas. So for 5 years, the Palestinians could move in, but had some restrictions. There could be an election of a Palestinian Legislative Council within 9 months, an establishment of a Palestinian police force, but Jerusalem was left undecided. No one wanted to touch Jerusalem. Everybody wanted full control of it, but no one was willing really to go to war. If you think about it, the Muslim mosques, the Islam mosques that are there, and it's the Temple Mount and the Old City, and Christians are involved in this too. It's not just the people that live and surround Israel that have borders with her. It's people of deep religious beliefs, whether right ones or wrong ones, that there's more that's involved. Who wants to go to war? That's what it's really all about. Barfield had a difficult time getting permits to conduct tests, but there was one Israel Knesset member, that's like their Senate or our Senate, who was an activist for the rebuilding of the Third Temple movement on the Temple Mount where the temples were. Moshe Feiglin volunteered to use his political immunity as a Knesset member to do the scanning for him and with him. Barfield was there. And so he was elected. He ran for office on the same party as Netanyahu. And there was an election that came up, and he got in because he was a big player on the Third Temple movement. And so in 2013, he became a Senate member, Knesset, and the next time there was an election, he was out. And the reason for this was that he was just avid of trying to find the temple treasure, and that would just confirm the Third Temple. And he rocked the boat immensely. And so these guys had to basically sneak to do any kind of scanning at Qumran and outside of the city. Even though as a senator, he could walk right in. There were people that they knew that as soon as they'd walk in, a guard would see them or something, and he'd show his pass, that there would be phone calls made, and the time that they would have would be very limited. The results from the scan indicated large amounts of gold and silver await uncovering, and they got 4 locations tested. And here's a scan of one of them. And Barfield went on the teaching circuit, and this is one of the slides that he used at the Temple Mount Conference in 18. So now we're just 3 years from where we are right now in our life. You can see the color coding and what they would mean. You'll see this again later. So here's Treasure Hunt 1, and this is where we'll end today. Going to go back and read. This is the very first treasure on the first page of the copper scroll. In the ruin, which is in the valley of Achor, under the steps heading eastward, 40 cubits long, are silver service vessels weighing 17 talents. So, the very first statement is this. You need to find the valley of Achor. And there's a ruin, or ruins, which is in the valley of Achor somewhere. And so Barfield sat down and he found the valley of Achor. It fell basically right south and east in the lighter brown area under that top blue arrow bar. And it would be on this side, the western side of the Jordan River. And then it would just run down to the west side of the Dead Sea and stop right around where the blue arrow is. Notice what city and ruins and what existed right there. It was the place of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran. So he went, that's what drew him to Qumran. Then we also said the steps extending eastward, 40 cubits long, are silver service vessels weighing 17 talents. That was 1,275 pounds of silver vessels. So the clues here, the Valley of Achor that I've already shared with you. Secondly, extending steps that point eastward, that you go down the steps and you're going eastward doing that. And then the steps have to measure 40 cubits. And so where in the world would these treasures be with buildings there? Or maybe there weren't the buildings at the time that the treasures were hidden. So back we go. And we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to, once again, the blue arrow is only our benchmark of where we are. Once again, the ritual bath pool is long, it's on an edge, and we are pointing the same directions. Now we're not pointing the same direction. We're facing east because there's a pool that faces east. And we've seen this, and it measures 40 cubits. And Barfield went ahead, and you still see the red dot that is there on the bottom. I put the red dot at the top and added that just turns things around and points things incorrectly. That's not going, it's not from going facing right and going that direction that makes it facing south. But Barfield has it correct. But that's what it would look like. And he feels that's the location, and it was a scan place. So guess what his machine found out? Once again, here we are from a satellite view, and we're facing the direction. The white arrow is pointing to where this treasure would be, treasure number 1, right there at the bottom of the tip. And once again, do you see the ritual bath to the far left, along what was once the outer wall? So it was found there. Once here is another picture. I want you to just keep seeing it and looking at it. And at the very tip of that arrow, in that area is where that would have been. And that's treasure 1. Here's all of our directions, and my white arrow is pointing to this long little snake, looks like a snake path. That's the waterways. I think I can go backwards. Do you see the water? And then how it snakes through and fills the ritual baths and also provides fresh water. And then another picture. There it is. And the direction it is facing east. It is facing the Dead Sea. And what did they get out of this, or what they will? They didn't get them out of there yet. There'd be almost 1,300 pounds of silver service vessels to be used in the temple. This is just a couple of what they may look like. But there would be lots of them, and they would weigh that much. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to pick it up with part 3 and end it all next session, next week in my Bible class. And I want to thank you for watching. I want to give a lot of credit to a lot of people here, not just for their pictures, but for their wisdom and the books that have been written, the individuals that they are, risks that they have taken. And so I would recommend read the Copper Scroll Project, read up on the Copper Scrolls, go digging, and go on a treasure hunt if you are further interested in this. Thank you, and God bless, and join us again next week when I record the next session.